Good evening, everyone. I'm Sara Cureton. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it's my great honor to welcome you here to tonight's program, Money, Power, Respect, Early Black Women Entrepreneurs and Community Leaders in New Jersey. I also want to offer you a great welcome from our Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State, Tahisha Way, because of course the New Jersey Historical Commission is a member of the Department of State under her great leadership. Now, every year the Historical Commission looks forward to February, which, as we all know, is Black History Month. It's an important time on our calendar, and one of the reasons for that is that it gives us a great opportunity to showcase the great work of our African American History program that does not just take place during February, but goes on throughout the year. So I do encourage all of you who are here tonight to be sure to sign up for our newsletter and be sure to mark on your calendar our upcoming programs, because we do have programs and initiatives in African American history throughout the year. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Noelle Lorraine Williams, who is the director of our African American History program, to introduce our speakers for this evening. Noelle, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And good evening, everyone. It's so great to be here with you all on a Thursday evening for Money, Power, Respect, Early Black Women Entrepreneurs and Community Leaders in New Jersey. As leaders in their communities or our communities, African American women have been at the forefront of fundraising, philanthropy, and advocating for the civil, social, and housing rights of Blacks in New Jersey, the nation, and actually throughout the Americas. Whether working to purchase the freedom of other enslaved people, entrepreneurship, or gathering community members for spiritual and political reasons as early as the 1700s and early 1800s, we see evidence of Black women leaders and entrepreneurs creating communities. With the creation of churches and then social and political groups in the mid to late 1800s, the stage for our 20th century activism would be set for Black women to continue to lead in a more visible, powerful, and even transformative ways. Today's discussion, including Betty Holloway and George Robb, will prove to be an amazing contribution to our understanding of how Black women have continued to enrich, contribute to, and build on the democracy and the social history of our lives here in New Jersey. So please join me in welcoming them both. Dr. George Robb is the professor emeritus at William Paterson University, where he taught history for almost 30 years. He is active in the Newark History Society and is currently working on writing a book about Newark in the early 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Robb.
Sorry, I'm just trying to start this. Here we go. All right. Thank you for that introduction, Noelle, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. In the early 20th century, a growing number of African American women in Newark broke economic barriers and cultural barriers by establishing and operating a wide range of businesses. These pioneering entrepreneurs had to overcome both sexist stereotypes that a woman's place was in the home and racist policies that sought to limit African American employment to unskilled, low-wage occupations. I've uncovered a lot of interesting information about Black women entrepreneurs in Newark during the first quarter of the 20th century, so from around 1900 to 1925. This was an era with key moment in both the history of Newark and its African American community. Newark's economy was at its peak, and the Black community experienced a new growth and dynamism, more than doubling in size with the great migration of African Americans up from the South. Tonight, I want to discuss the various employment opportunities available to Black women in Newark a century ago, but also discuss the challenges of researching this topic, the kinds of evidence that's available, and the limitations of certain types of historical evidence. Until recently, government agencies, universities, libraries, archives, and historical societies didn't bother to collect and preserve information about the activities and accomplishments of Black women. So let's start with a basic source of information about Black women's employment in Newark or anywhere, the United States Census. The 1900 census shows us that Black women in Newark worked at far higher rates than white women. While overall 45% of Black women worked for wages in Newark, the figure was even higher for young Black women. The percentage of women, Black and white, who worked for wages declined over the course of a woman's life cycle. As women married and had children, they began leaving the job market. But for Black women, this was much less so. Black men's wages were much less. So it was difficult for them to support a wife. Black women certainly advocated for better wages and better jobs for Black men, but they also wanted better employment opportunities for themselves. Here, the 1900 census shows some of the jobs most frequently performed by white women in Newark. And this represents a wide variety of employment opportunities when we set it against the statistics for Black women workers in Newark, according to the 1900 census. The census only lists 2 occupations for Black women, servant and laundress, which were the lowest paid and the lowest status jobs available. The census doesn't bother to enumerate this category of other. It doesn't bother to enumerate what are some of the other occupations for Black women in Newark. And that's a category that we're going to explore tonight. But first, let me express some reservations about the census. Historically, the census has counted minority populations, and there are many reasons for believing that it has not provided a very accurate picture of Black people's employment, especially Black women's. What does the census leave out? Well, these are some of the things which the census leaves out. There's a vast array of economic opportunities that lay outside the formal system of full-time wage labor, which is what the census records. Black women were especially drawn to these categories due to the double-edged bind of racist and sexist economic barriers which they faced. Let's look at some of the work that does not get listed in the census. Uncredited work in a family business. Family businesses were usually listed in a man's name, and women's contributions were often not credited. So Henry Brown had an undertaking business in Newark. His wife, Kathleen, worked in this business, but she's not listed in the census as working at all. Just one example. Part-time work in multiple jobs. These are the kinds of jobs that might be engaged in full-time, but many women listed on the census with no occupations or who are listed as homemakers could be making extra money by teaching piano or sewing. And these were common occupations for women, but for Black women, certainly. This is one example, one fairly exotic or extreme example, Blanche Harris, who I like to think of as the hardest working woman in Newark. Until a couple of years ago, she was completely forgotten and unknown. She was a very important figure in African-American community in Newark, though she appears in no histories of Newark at all. But these are just some of the paid occupations that Blanche Harris engaged in between 1900 and 1930, but they don't turn up on the census. In 1900, she's listed as having no occupation. In 1910, she's listed as a homemaker. Now, at any given time, she wasn't doing all of these jobs, but at any given time, she was doing several of them, and they simply do not appear on the official record. The informal economy refers to many ways of making money outside of formal wage labor. The historian Robert Boyd coined the term survivalist entrepreneur to describe Black people who became self-employed in response to desperate need to find independent means of livelihood. So there's a long tradition going back to slavery times of Black women selling goods, often food, at street markets or from door to door. Also, because so many Black women worked outside the homes, childcare was a serious concern. Many Black women in Newark rented rooms to help make ends meet. Black people in Newark in the early 20th century could usually find work, but finding a place to live was not so easy. Many landlords wouldn't rent to Black people. There was serious housing discrimination in most neighborhoods in Newark. In the early 20th century, Black Newarkers were crowded into the central wards of the city, downtown area, and certain areas in the ironbound section of Newark along the railroad tracks. A one-family home might accommodate 2 or 3 Black families or be bursting at the seams with boarders. This is one example. Georgia Queen, she was a widow, and she was listed in the 1900 census as a domestic, but clearly she was also a boarding house keeper, as she had 11 different boarders in her house, but she's not officially listed as such. So there's going to be a lot of Black women, probably most Black women in Newark, because of the housing situation, are going to be renting out rooms to boarders. And so that's an occupation that just doesn't get counted. Or Georgia Queen gets counted as a domestic servant, but she doesn't get counted as a boarding house keeper. The underground economy includes a vast array of jobs that weren't recorded in the census because they were illegal. And we'll talk about some of these. This, I just want to mention, is a recent excellent book about the underground economy in New York City. And it argues that some Black women embraced these jobs because it provided labor autonomy and opportunities for success in an otherwise restricted marketplace. Now, finding information about women who are working in the underground economy or illegal jobs is very difficult for obvious reasons. Here is one Black woman in Newark who was arrested for running a disorderly house, which was a euphemism at the time for a brothel. Okay, so this has been a very quick survey about some of the work available to Black women in Newark, apart from being a servant or a laundress. Since the census mostly overlooks this work, where else can we find out about Black women's work and entrepreneurial activities? City directors are a good source. Almost all cities or towns, even small towns at the time, had a city directory, which listed a person's address, but also listed their occupation. This is useful for cross-checking against the census. It also lists business categories. So, for example, under dressmaker, there'd be several pages with hundreds of women listed as dressmaker. Now, it's hard to find Black women in there because you're going to have to look up every single woman dressmaker in the census to see which of those women were Black and which were white. So it's a tedious thing to do, but it is possible to do if you want to locate, find Black women entrepreneurs within just the larger categories of women workers. This is a very interesting source for Newark. It was a directory of Negro businesses in Essex County, which includes a lot of examples from Newark. Unfortunately, it's a one-off. It was only published in 1920, but it's a very valuable resource for what a lot of Black people were doing business-wise, including a lot of people who are not listed, whose jobs are not listed officially on the census. Another important source are church publications. This is a history of Bethany Baptist Church, one of the oldest African-American churches in Newark. It was published for 1921 for the 50th anniversary. But African-American churches were important community centers for the Black community. And church histories were very common. And they were an interesting source. You know, you wouldn't think a church history would be a place to find out about business, but they list a lot of the church members and the kind of jobs which they did. So after mining some of these sources, as many as I could, what were some of the occupations I found under other for Black women who were doing work in Newark apart from being a servant or a laundress, which were the only occupations listed on the census. These are some of the major jobs that were being done. And now I'm going to be concentrating tonight on independent business women, not on wage laborers. So I won't be looking at waitresses or factory workers, but I'll be looking at women who ran their own businesses. And these are some of the principal examples, right? These businesses often clustered in certain broad categories, especially food and hospitality and fashion. In part, this is work that was traditionally gendered as feminine, cooking and sewing, or these businesses catered to women, like hairdressing. But another consideration is segregation. Many of these businesses provided goods and services to Black Newarkers that white businesses were unwilling or uninterested in providing. So I need to say a little bit something about how segregation worked in northern cities like Newark and how that differed from segregation in the South. Jim Crow refers to a whole series of laws and practices that disenfranchised Black people and segregated society in the decades following the Civil War. Jim Crow was strongest in the American South, where the vast majority of Black people lived. But this began to change in the early 20th century with the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities like Newark. In the South, segregation was obvious and everywhere. Whites-only signs were ubiquitous, and separate and unequal facilities were the rule. In Newark, like other northern towns, there was little public segregation in the early 20th century. Blacks and whites could ride together on trains, streetcars, and buses and sit wherever they wanted. There weren't separate entrances or waiting rooms or bathrooms or water fountains for the races in Newark's public buildings or train stations or municipal buildings. Newark schools weren't segregated. One notable exception were the public swimming pools in Newark, which Black people could only use 1 day a week. Black people could vote in New Jersey, unlike in most southern states. And they did vote, and they organized politically and socially in ways that were not possible in the South. But segregation still existed in other ways. Many landlords, as I said before, wouldn't rent to Black people. Private businesses and organizations often excluded Black people. So when talking about segregation in the North, African Americans often called it James Crow. It wasn't as obvious or brutal as in the South, but it was there all the same. So some trade unions in Newark accepted Black members, others didn't. Some Newark theaters refused Black patrons. Others sold them tickets but made them sit in the balcony. The Dreamland amusement park in Newark would admit Black people, but it often charged them twice as much as white patrons. Which brings us to restaurants, which were highly segregated in Newark. Black women ran restaurants in Newark, not just because cooking was seen as feminine, but because most white restaurants wouldn't serve Black people. Now, I don't know much about these particular women who I've located, though Alethea Jefferson was the mother of Blanche Harris, who I mentioned earlier as the hardest working woman in Newark. And that was her first job, was working with her mother in this restaurant. Here are some more food-related businesses operated by Black women in Newark. Some of them supplied foods that recent transplants from the South craved, but weren't available in most Newark shops, things like cornmeal, grits, black-eyed peas, and okra. You can see Miss Birdsong sold nothing but chitlins for those people who wanted to dine low on the hog. Dressmakers and milliners, or hat makers. This was an important category of Black women's businesses. And these women listed here are just a sample of at least 15 African-American women with dress or hat shops in Newark in the late teens or early 1920s. The Great Migration increased the Black population in Newark and led to the creation of new consumer markets for Black people. Even the lowest paid Black women in Newark had more spending money than their Southern counterparts. For example, in the early 20th century, Black domestics in Newark earned between $4 and $6 a week, which was a very low wage, but it was a lot better than the $2 a week earned by most Black maids in the South. Jim Crow also created entrepreneurial opportunities for Black women who are often denied service by white businesses or treated as second-class service. For example, white clothing stores in Newark that might sell goods to Black women, but they wouldn't let them try on hats or dresses. Department stores, large department stores in Newark, like Bamberger's or Hanes, you could buy clothes cheaper than at these shops run by Black women, but Black women in Newark patronize these Black-owned businesses because they offer their customers personal and respectful service. The biggest increase in Black women's business was in the category of hairdressers and beauty parlors. This is what economists call a protected market, referring to the refusal or the disinterest of white business people to provide a service. And these are just a few of more than 40 women in Newark who operated hair care businesses in the early 1920s. This was the largest category by far of any Black-owned businesses in Newark, including businesses owned by Black men. The growth of the African-American beauty business was facilitated by the professionalization in the manufacture and sale of Black hair care products and cosmetics. The guiding lights to this industry were Madam C.J. Walker and Annie Turnbow Malone. They created, they're not Newarkers, but they created factories to manufacture their products and beauty schools to teach their techniques. They also franchised beauty parlors around the country. Walker is usually credited as the first Black millionaire in America, and she's possibly the first woman millionaire in America of any race who was self-made. Here's an example of a Black woman in Newark who had a Walker franchise. She had a beauty shop that was using the Walker system of hair straightening. By the 1920s, Walker's beauty empire was in decline, steadily eclipsed by another Black entrepreneur, New Jersey businesswoman Sarah Spencer Washington. Based in Atlantic City, the Apex News and Hair Company operated several factories and beauty schools, including one in Newark, which you can see was on West Kinney Street. This 1930s ad for Newark's Simplex School of Beauty Culture emphasizes the economic independence afforded Black women by training as beauticians. The women who worked in a beauty parlor could make 2 to 3 times as much money as a woman working as a domestic servant. Now, I'm going to finish by looking at the insurance industry in Newark and a few of the Black women who made a living by providing financial services to the Black community. Newark was a major insurance center in the United States, home to large corporations like Prudential and Mutual Benefit. In the early 20th century, these businesses employed thousands of Newarkers, including a growing number of women, white women. They did not employ Black people of either sex, except as janitors or cleaning ladies. Most of Newark's leading insurance companies also wouldn't sell policies to Black people, or else they treated Black customers unequally to white customers. That is, Black lives were literally valued less than white lives. So not surprisingly, Black Newarkers once again created their own businesses to fill a void. These are the main Black-owned insurance businesses operating in Newark around 1920, and it's quite an impressive number and array of them. These businesses employed some Black women in clerical positions, but the officers and directors of these companies were all Black men. Nonetheless, a few enterprising Black women created opportunities for themselves in Newark's growing financial sector. Anna Whittington worked as a real estate broker, insurance agent, and notary public. I've not been able to find a photograph of Whittington, but this is an image of Upper Bank Street near her office. Upper Bank Street was an important center of Black-owned businesses in Newark. It no longer exists. It's now where the Essex County Community campus is, but it's what I would consider a Black Wall Street. That's a term historians have coined to refer to prosperous business centers in Black African-American business centers in towns around the United States. Betty Lightfoot was also a real estate broker and insurance agent. She established the New Jersey Real Estate Investment Company to help finance Black home ownership at a time when most banks wouldn't give Black people mortgages. Georgia Queen, who I showed earlier, who in 1900 was struggling to support her family as a domestic and a boarding house keeper, had by 1910 reinvented herself as an agent for the Independent Order of St. Luke, which was a fraternal organization that sold life and burial insurance. That was something that was more common 100 years ago. Georgia Queen was recruited by Maggie Lena Walker, the director of the Order of St. Luke, based in Richmond, Virginia. Walker is a well-known figure in American finance. She was the first Black woman in the United States to found a bank. And in the early 20th century, she was the only woman bank president in America. Walker had become the director of the Order of St. Luke in the 1890s at a time when the Virginia-centered fraternal order was in decline. To the surprise of the men who had presided over its decline, Walker revitalized the society and greatly increased its insurance business. She also expanded the society and its insurance sales northward into the growing Black communities in northern cities. Walker must have met Georgia Queen during one of her recruiting trips to Newark. Most of Walker's paid agents and company officers were women. Georgia Queen proved to be the most successful agent of the Order of St. Luke in America. She organized more than 50 councils across New Jersey and in parts of New York and Connecticut, including these 11 councils in Newark alone. So these are like fraternal organizations, but they're ones that sell insurance. So it's an interesting kind of concept. Georgia Queen's achievement is especially impressive given her background. She was born in Virginia in 1860, possibly enslaved. She and her husband moved to Newark in the 1880s, where he worked as a teamster and she as a maid. Mr. Queen's death in 1892 plunged his wife and her young daughter into financial insecurity. As we saw, her small house was bursting with 11 boarders in 1900. But by 1910, she was financially secure as an insurance agent, and she only had one boarder, a Black woman who was probably working as Queen's domestic. And not surprisingly, Blanche Harris also sold insurance for the Order of St. Luke, and sometimes working in tandem with Georgia Queen. Okay, so in conclusion, I'd like to have us to think just a little bit about the issue of representation. The Newark women I've been profiling this evening not only had to struggle against racist and sexist barriers which impeded their economic advancement, but they had to live in a society where their impressive achievements were downplayed, dismissed, and underreported. For some white Americans, it was impossible to imagine Black women in any role other than a servant. This poster from 1918 is a case in point. It's one of the very few images from World War I that depicted Black Americans' contributions to the war. It was intended to convey the point that Black people were patriotic citizens, just like white Americans, but not everyone saw it that way. A white postmistress in Florida sent this poster to the Postmaster General as seditious material, which the 1917 Espionage Act had banned from being sent through the mail. This white woman could not see the poster's patriotic message since she was enraged by its representation of Black people in comfortable middle-class surroundings. To depict Black people other than as poor and servile seemed like treason or communist propaganda, which this white postmistress thought this was communist propaganda. Right. So 100 years ago, American popular culture, newspapers, magazines, advertisements, movies, and radio was saturated with demeaning images of Black women as servants and Jemima. But contrary images of upwardly mobile and economically independent Black women were nowhere to be seen in mainstream culture. So this is a photograph of Black women working for an insurance company. Unfortunately, not a Newark insurance company. I was not been able to find an image like that. But it still remains very difficult to find such images today and to recover the history of these trailblazing Black women from Newark and from other cities as well. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for that. My apologies, everyone, my alarm is going off. So, Dr. George Robb, thank you for that presentation. That was amazing. It's just amazing to see the diversity and also just the various ways that African-American women worked to create community and create lives for themselves in New Jersey. I am also excited to present our next speaker, Ms. Betty Holloway. Betty Holloway is an individual who has devoted her life to education and community service. She worked as an educator for more than 30 years before retiring. Upon retirement, Betty turned her attention towards researching her family's genealogy. However, like many African-American genealogy researchers, she encountered a common roadblock. To overcome this hurdle, Betty began researching people she had heard about through her participation in various organizations in Montclair. Her research led her to discover many hidden historical treasures in the town that she felt the public needed to be reminded of. Betty shares her findings with audiences at different events and locations throughout the community, introducing them to notable figures who lived and contributed to the community. She also collaborated with the Montclair African American Heritage Foundation to create a historical legacy tour and created history panels for display at community events. Betty led a fundraising campaign to install a headstone for Alice Huey Foster, founder of the Montclair YWCA, which you will hear about more tonight, at Mount Hebron Cemetery. Betty continues to pursue her passion for uncovering more important stories as a member of the Friends of the House History Research Team. She is a longtime resident of Montclair and holds degrees from North Carolina Central University and Montclair State University. In 2023, Betty completed a year-long training program for local church historians through the General Commission on Archives and History of the United Methodist Church. Also, she was recognized by the Montclair Historic Preservation Commission with the Historic Preservation Award as Preservationist of the Year. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Betty Holloway.
Thank you, Noelle. You just reminded me that I need to shorten that introduction. Thank you, everyone who has joined us tonight on this tour, on this, not tour, but tonight's talk. I just want to share my, okay, here we go. So my interest in Alice Huey Foster came about while a member of the YMCA, where I am a member, was in charge of Black History Month programs. And she knew that members of our church had been involved in the organization of the YWCA in the early 1900s. And she wanted me to find out who those women were and to present in a Black History program at the YMCA, present to them who these women were. During the course of my research, I was finding more information about Alice Huey Foster, and I became more interested in her and what her story was. And then as I researched her more, I found that Alice Huey Foster and her family were closely attached. And so I cannot tell a story about Alice Huey Foster without giving you some information about her family as well. I'm sharing this picture of the friends, the James and Susan Howe House. I'm a part of a group called the Friends of the Howe House, and we just celebrated a year of having purchased the Howe House. So what does the Howe House have to do with Alice Huey Foster? The archives at the History Center had a treasure trove of information about the woman who built the large enough house that could be called a mansion, which is really quite common in that area, which is located on Claremont Avenue at the corner, almost near the corner of Upper Mountain Avenue, if you're familiar with the area. It's sort of up on a hill, and you can stand there and kind of you'll see the skyline of New York City. So I found a note that was probably written to Emily Welsh, and it was a story told to her by the postman. And the postman, because she was interested in the history of that house, she eventually purchased the house and rented it for a number of years before she passed on, and it landed in the hands of her children. The note said that the postman told her that Alice Huey of the YWCA was born on this property. So I found that very interesting because during the course of my research, it started in 1878, or it started at the birth, at Alice's birth, but I couldn't get about 4 years, couldn't find where they were and what they were doing from about 1874 to 1878. So that little note gave me an indication of where they were because I had found them in other places. So as you see this picture here, I'm using silhouettes too, because I only have 2 pictures of members of the Huey family. But I want to highlight the name of Clifford, his father, and Alice, who became the ones that I found a lot of information about in terms of their contributions to their family. The population in Montclair, the African-American population, we're remembering that the first of the Crane family were given a land grant to develop in this area, like around 1668. And Azariah Crane was one of the first of the Crane family who were founders of Newark. And at one time, this was all of one area. From 1668, it was nothing but farmland here. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Hueys, who were from Loudoun County or lived in Loudoun County, Virginia, they were part of that first 1870 Great Migration. So you can see the population that has been found so far of African Americans in this area in 1870 was 36. And it began to steadily grow as the huge homes in this area were built. When this family first came here, they got here around 1874, and I haven't found any evidence of them having to be a servant in anyone's home or a laborer on anyone's farm. It seemed as though when they got here that they began to pave the way for themselves in various entrepreneurial pursuits. I found this ad from, or this is the telephone directory, the business area of the telephone directory in 1892, showing where the Hueys lived. And also on the right, if you look down under news dealers, it shows the Huey brothers on Bloomfield Avenue. So what had happened? When they arrived here in Montclair, Montclair was a favored area for the African Americans from the Loudoun County, Virginia area to migrate to because they were advertising for jobs here. And so what kind of work did Charles Huey and his oldest sons engage in when they got here? So I found that they were gardeners, and then the father was a sexton. He became a carpet layer, and then he entered the news dealer business, and then they had a bicycle repair and storage facility. And so if you notice how the sons were involved, Alice was their first child born here in Montclair. And so Alice, through the Montclair public school system, was really a star and showed a lot of promise as a leader. her oldest brother, Clifford, had also shown great leadership ability because he was the one that bought a little newsstand that ultimately became their business. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Here's Alice, and this is 1890, when she had finished middle school and she was going on to high school. She was given an examination, and that's what they did. That was customary in this area at that time. She was given an exam to see whether or not she could pass from middle school to high school. And as you can see here, you may not be able to read it, but she was given a provisional admittance to Montclair High School in 1890. And of course, in 1894, she did graduate, and she had an important part in the graduation ceremony. And the most important part was that Alice was the first African-American to graduate from Montclair Public Schools. And she, to this day, continues to have that distinction. So I spoke earlier about Clifford, the oldest son, who at a young age, he was helping his father in the gardening business. I think they hired themselves out to several families, but there was also the opportunity for them to take newspapers to customers. There were a number of publications in the area that they could have established a lucrative business. The little stand here is this picture was taken around 1885, and this little stand to the left really dumbfounded me for quite a while, because I didn't understand how the Hueys could have operated a little business out of it. But it had been sold twice prior to them, but it was a fruit stand at one time owned by a woman, and then the other owner was also a newspaper dealer. So they operated out of this little newsstand here for a couple of years before moving their business to an establishment close to the building that you're looking at here. So again, we're still looking at the legitimacy of their business, and the growth of their business is indicated here. This is a picture of the 1898 parade celebrating the ending of the Spanish-American War. And I've drawn like a little red line over there. You see the people standing all the way over to the right. That is the Huey's newspaper and tobacco store. Now, I mentioned earlier that Alice had graduated from high school in 1894. Earlier in that year, in April 1894, tragedy struck their family, and their brother Clifford died from tainted milk from a farm up in Verona. So Clifford had been a leader in being one of the co-owners with his brother William in this particular business, but it was a family business. All of the family members worked there. But Alice, at graduation from Montclair High School in 1894, went off to college to Howard University down in Washington, D.C. So you see here later, this is a picture of what the Huey's newspaper and tobacco store looked like in 1894. This article appeared in the Montclair Times in 1943. It was a celebration of the Montclair Savings Bank, and it was the 35th anniversary of 35 years of the Montclair Savings Bank. So I call it big business gobbling up little business. So they moved from that little box and built this structure, which was their store, which was a very popular place because people were passing there to go down to the Lackawanna train station as they commuted to their businesses in New York. So this is what that corner looks like today, and I think the Rau tomato sauce business is operating out of there, but there is no banking to this day. In one of the successes of the Hui family around 1892 was that the leader and one of the developers of this bank, his name was Ed Goodell. Clifford Hui and his father, Charles Hui, walked into his office, to the office of the Chancery down in Newark, and paid $3,300 for a home that they had bought in 1892 up on Maple Place, right off of Bloomfield Avenue. So you can imagine that it was pretty devastating that Clifford, they would have lost Clifford in just 2 years after having moved into this brand new home that he was so much a part of. And he was only about 20 or 21 years old at that point. He was also celebrated for having passed the civil service exam to be a letter carrier. So he was also a postman, in addition to a part of their business was delivering newspapers to the homes here in Montclair. So, so we're moving along. By 1910, the Montclair Savings Bank had run the newspaper business out of circulation. They had started home deliveries and, you know, operating out of their home at another location in Montclair where they lived. And they moved the business to Glen Ridge and Bloomfield Avenue, where I showed you that picture. And so by 1910, they were out of business, but all was not lost because they were doing other things. So you see here, Montclair is steadily growing. The African-American population is steadily growing. So with that comes a number of community concerns, education, housing, a number of things. So in 1906, Alice and her sister Grace, who was the bookkeeper for the business, Alice and her sister Grace must have seen the writing on the wall, because in 1906, Alice and her sister purchased this building here. And they owned that building until 1940, when tragedy again struck the family. And in that building, Alice, there were a number of other businesses that operated here out of this business on the first level. There was a hair salon, there was a dental practice, there was a dry goods store, there was a milliner shop that was operated by her sister. And there were the lower level here, the front of this building, there were also general meetings such as the Black Republican clubs that met there, and also programs for the YWCA that met there. Today, this is a smoke shop. It's called the Fume Shop. And when you go inside on the first level, it is beautifully decorated with walnut and leather furniture for a luxurious smoking atmosphere. And I hope you find that as facetiously as I do. On the top level there, in addition to Alice, who had married by then, by 1911, they were living in apartments above that building, along with her sister and her husband, and a Chinese couple named Yu Loi Sing, who owned a laundry. I haven't tracked down the exact location of that laundry, but that's next on my list. But Also, during this particular time, what was customary with Y programs in most states was that there was a white Y and there was a black Y. In Montclair, there was the Ladies Auxiliary for the YMCA, which was the white Y. And then in 1906, they gave permission for there to be a Y for Black men. And so at that time, they were colored. And so what happened was ladies auxiliaries were very popular at that time. And Alice became the president of the Ladies Auxiliary from 1906 to 1912 when the Y for colored men had been established. So she was a pretty busy lady running the Ladies Auxiliary and being a member of other clubs. And I think this time period up to 1920 was, it was often referred to as the progressive era. So we'll talk about that and what was Alice's motivation. So the influence of the progressive era, which a lot of women were engaged in, Alice, in addition to some of the concerns that they had, was social justice. This Black women and white women, social justice, the women's suffrage, and a focus on community upliftment. And so this is the category that I think Alice became most concerned with, you know, through her leadership as the president of the Ladies Auxiliary for the YWCA. But in March of 1912, she was inspired by a lecture she heard on civic responsibility at the St. Luke's Church here in Montclair. And that led her to organize a group of women to develop the Montclair YWCA. So she gathered a group. At the time, this is where the church was located. We're talking about 1912. It was located on Bloomfield Avenue. And she got a group of women from St. Mark's Methodist Church and Union Baptist, which is a side note here about St. Mark's. Her mother, I recently found out that she was one of the 25 organizers of St. Mark's United Methodist Church. And Union Baptist Church was the second African-American church, St. Mark's being organized in 1880 and Union Baptist being organized in 1887. And so these are the group of women that Alice pulled together from, and they represented women from all walks of life. Some were wives of physicians and they were homemakers. Some were women who worked in service. And others, as I mentioned, they were basically stay-at-home moms, and they were community organizers themselves, very much involved in what was going on in the community. I failed to mention that during the progressive era, it ushered in a lot of club women organizations. And I think for white women and Black women, and especially in the Black community, clubs were springing up and were doing a number of things in the community. So I have been on a quest to recreate or find pictures of those women that met with Alice to form the YWCA. And these, I have been able, of the 17 women that she pulled together who were board of managers and charter members, I have been able to get 4 of them. And only recently I received Mrs. Terry's picture there. So these are the women who came together to show their interest in doing something for the increase in the migration of women from the South looking for jobs and helping them to develop their skills. And that's pretty much what the YWCA was trying to do. The Young Women's Christian Association, of course, Bible teaching was very much a part of what they were doing, and also teaching ladies dressmaking skills and in-service skills, and also helping them to look out for themselves and their families. So this, the first location of the YWCA that Alice was able to find was this house on the left. Now, I won't be able to show you this again, but I want you to remember this house and the house on the right. So these are a number of the organizations that Alice became a member of during that progressive era. And some of the things that they were trying to teach the public was, you know, who are these new Negroes in this era, because slavery was over. We were moving on to a different life. And so she brought in a number of these well-known names that you're probably familiar with. One of the most memorable pieces of information that I found was Booker T. Washington had made several visits to Montclair, but this was a very special visit that he made. He was looking for a site, for a permanent site for the YMCA, because he was in close partnership with the philanthropist Julius Rosenwald. And so he wanted a big show of the progress of the Negroes in Montclair. And so on the date that this was a statewide visit. And as you can see on the program there were a number of cities that he visited in the state of New Jersey. Montclair was just one of them. And so one of the way that he wanted a show of Negro progress in Montclair was a parade. And so they developed a parade for him that marched from that building I showed you, was the first location of the YWCA, to the building that I showed you that Alice and her sister Grace bought. It was a parade to show Booker T. Washington what the progress was in the community. Now, in this souvenir booklet, they do mention the Hueys, and the Hueys are and particularly the YWCA program, they're the only group that's really mentioned by name. And so the writer of this souvenir booklet also mentions that the Huey, Charles Huey, had amassed a considerable fortune of $40,000 at that time. Because remember, I told you that they were engaged in a number of business enterprises. And I looked up what the equivalency of $40,000 is today, and it's over $1 million. So when you're in town and you go on a tour of the Crane House and Historic YWCA, you will see this picture in the hallway. And so the bottom picture there is the founder, Alice Huey Foster. And the top picture there was a very popular lady who is still remembered, Mrs. Hortense Tate. So Alice, in 1940, was celebrated in this book that was published by Thomas Yenzer. And what he was doing was going around the country and cataloging what successful Black people were doing all around the country. This was his 6th edition. And Alice was one of the featured, featured individuals that was listed there. Oh, I don't know what happened, but you know, it seems like the picture is not showing. It cut me off there. Okay. There we go. Oh, it ends there. So at any rate, this is Alice's bio, and it has a lot of what I talked about. And here is Noelle read a bio celebrating the Headstone delegation, and this is the group of us that installed the headstone in honor of Alice Huey Foster. We did the same thing last weekend at the History Center, the Crane House, and Historic YWCA. They've done a very creative thing there in bridging the two residences that occupied that particular house. So I thank you, and I do hope we have lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Holloway, and thank you, Dr. Robb. And so I just want to say thank you both for these presentations. And I would like to encourage folks who have questions to put them in the chat. Rachel is going to read the questions in the Q&A. My colleague, Rachel Thimke from the New Jersey Historical Commission will be relaying the questions from the chat. First, I would just like to say these presentations are stellar because they combine both sites that still exist here in the Essex County area and sites that are now gone. Particularly as we think about developing the Black Heritage Trail over the next couple of years, and how to make these histories visible for folks. It's interesting to have this kind of dance between buildings that now have new purposes that people may not know. There was some type of history of Black uplift, Black liberation, and sustaining. And that there are now places, like Dr. Robb said, and also in Ms. Holloway's presentation, where there are actual like streets of Black businesses. Another thing before we go to the question is that one of the things I think both of your presentations also highlight is the need to also present early West Indian women's histories in New Jersey. I think often when we think of women from the Caribbean, the so-called West Indies, and other spaces, we generally think of the migration in the last 20, 30, 40 years, whereas there's a very early history, especially in Essex County, even if we look at the early 1800s, of African Americans going to places like Haiti and coming back, going to places like Trinidad, but even more so to see the development of these organizations in places like Newark and Essex County later on. So thank you for highlighting that need. And so I guess we will proceed with the questions. So Rachel, which is the first question?
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of great questions in the chat. Please feel free to keep adding them or to the Q&A section as we go. The first one is for Dr. Robb. How did you find most of the women you profile?
I think the city directories were helpful, but the Black church histories were really useful as well. And a lot of the photographs I had, it's really hard to find photographs, you know, and the mainstream newspapers at the time, you know, which were white owned, didn't usually cover what was going on in the African American community very much. So some of these Black church histories do include photographs of people who they saw as like distinguished members of the church or people who had businesses and things like that. So the church histories were very helpful, and the city directories were really helpful, much more so than like the newspapers of the census.
Thank you for that. Our next question is for Ms. Holloway. What are the plans for the Howe House?
Well, the first thing we're working on right now, I'm a part of the research team, is that we're seeking landmark status. And I think that will give us, we want to be on the National Historic Registry. That'll give us a lot more leverage. And so we are have a visioning team that is discussing, you know, what is the best usage for that property, and how can we open it up so that it will open it up so that it'll be a place of learning. Now, the house is extremely small. It may look like there's a lot of space there, but the staircase, and I may be exaggerating only a little bit, the staircase is that wide. So I have to go up sideways. So there's not a lot of space, as you can imagine, in a slave house. So we've got to be very imaginative in terms of how we make that space available to the public. But to make a long story short, we are still trying to get together our thoughts on it, and but the most pressing issue for right now is to get on the National Registry, landmark status, to get landmark status. And that's an arduous project. If you've never been through that before, it is pretty awesome. But we're also developing a partnership with the anthropology department at Montclair State University to assist us with a lot of what we're doing. So we're reaching out and going along pretty quickly.
Sounds like really wonderful. Excited for it. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the questions to do one that kind of dovetails off that, but would apply to everyone here. How do you commemorate locations no longer in existence that tell the story of Black women pioneers?
Well, I'll just start off with the answers, and then Ms. Holloway and Dr. Robb will. I think one of the ways we do that is through forums like this, right? So at the New Jersey Historical Commission, the programs that we present about various regions and communities across the state. I think another way is through exhibitions. For example, the New Jersey Historical Commission helped to fund a suffrage exhibition that actually Dr. Robb and I worked on at Newark Public Library. And there's actually still a virtual representation of it on the Newark Public Library digital.mpl.org. So you can actually still print the panels. I think a lot of what, and I'm sure Ms. Holloway will talk about this, is through actually creating tours. So one of the things that the Montclair African American History Group does is they create tours so that people can reimagine these spaces, again, in concert with sites that still exist. And then finally, one of the things that we're doing with the Black Heritage Trail is marking some of these spaces, but already people in communities have marked these spaces with plaques, murals, tours, exhibition, street renaming, which is something that is very accessible for the public in kind of remembering people and places that might have existed there.
Well, Noelle, I think you've laid out an excellent plan, because, you know, a lot of that, that was one of the things that we wanted to do with the Legacy Tour, to make sure that people driving around town would have a different vision about what was here before, and why people are so proud of Montclair, and they have this special feeling about Montclair. So what does all that mean? So we're hoping that these Legacy Tour and bringing attention to people like Alice Huey Foster. Now, there are other women that that we have in the pipeline that I even have to, that need to be highlighted, but we have to get the research done. That's a big part of this, especially in our community, because, you've already noted that a lot of the newspapers didn't highlight them, and they're like in obscurity. You don't know who they are. Their histories have been lost. So unless you bring them forward and, make that information available to the public, which is why we keep bringing up Alice Huey Foster's name, because of the major contributions, where when people talk about the YWCA in Montclair, they don't really know that they are talking about Alice Huey Foster and a group of other women who were dedicated to helping women and children who were migrating to that area. And they saw that there was an institution that people could depend on. They still talk about it. It's a part of their memory, what the Y meant to them. So we just need to do more of it, bring it forward, and put a plaque on it. We have one on the parsonage for our first African American church, but shrubbery has hidden it. So when you walk on Bloomfield Avenue and you look for, oh, what is this building here? Why does it still look so old? We have to cut down the shrubbery, but it's private property, so we can't do that much about it. So, the research, the plaque designation, the programming, such as the one that we had last weekend, and others, I would think that would be a step forward.
It's a great question. And I was impressed, Betty Holloway's presentation on how many sites in Montclair are still standing. But, listen, nice suburb, so much of historic Newark has just been leveled. So, that's depressing when you try to, like, if you want to organize a walking tour, it's like, oh, and this used to be, there used to be something here, but it's not, this whole neighborhood has been torn down and something else has been built there. So it's a challenge for sure. But I think both Betty and Noelle have given some good examples. And Noelle, you did an exhibit at the public library about like the 19th century African-American community in Newark. And I was really impressed by, you did these maps of sort of like Newark today. And then you did kind of like these ghost images of buildings that used to exist, like old African-American churches, and kind of where they were, where they used to be. So that's a kind of a way, I think, an interesting way to sort of visually represent to people what the neighborhoods used to be like, or what structure, before it was all kind of just torn down.
Yeah, and I would just like to piggyback on Dr. Robb's comments. Yeah, I mean, I think someone had a question about, I think it was Black Wall Street. I think they wanted to ask the street. And I think, so that was Bank Street, and I think Dr. Robb can say a little bit more about it. One of the things why I'm just so compelled by all of these stories is because they really change the way in which we understand Black, Afro diaspora, African, West Indian, Caribbean, all of these African American communities that exist in our region. And the ways in which, like, I think there's a real estate business on a realtor on Bloomfield Avenue, whose business has been there for how many years? I think it's been 60 or 70 years.
The St. Allen Realty, which is, it was established in 1948, and in 1972, his daughter, Catherine Allen Curry, took over the business, and she still runs St. Allen Realty.
Yeah, and I think often these conversations about business, self-uplift, education, community building, they're often not engaging Black and African-American Afro-diaspora history. So I think it's very important that we're able to present these. And then I think also there's the opportunity, some instructors and teachers in the K through 12 areas have been using different things like exhibitions, plaques, et cetera, in their work. So as we continue to kind of strengthen our educational system, this is what we're doing in the public sphere to continue to enrich people's education about how people have contributed to our civic, the power of our civic and civil lives here in New Jersey. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, Noelle, I'm glad you made a point about like Caribbeans, people from the West Indies, because too often when the story of the Great Migration is told, it's just about Black people from the American South moving up north. And of course, that was a huge part of it, but people don't, in the early 1900s, there are a lot of people from Jamaica, especially the British West Indies and the Bahamas and Bermuda, including to places like Newark. And so a lot of the women I found entrepreneurs in Newark and other African-American entrepreneurs in Newark in the early 20th century, some of them did originate from the Caribbean. And that's a story I think that tends to get ignored, and even by a lot of African-American people who don't know about it. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, I agree. We considered that, especially in Montclair, even in my church, the formation of my church. And I would dare to say that we would go back to the late 19th century, where we have found immigrants coming to this area. So I agree. And we are moving forward here in this community to look at the whole community, not just the women, but I'm sure that will be a part of what will be revealed in our research.
And yeah, I don't want to belabor the point, but it's interesting, even just studying the early 1800s, and as African Americans are thinking of the different ways in which to find freedom. Some folks, even here in downtown Newark, they immigrate to Trinidad, and some folks actually go to Haiti. And then you have some folks who come here. And so there's always kind of this conversation with the diaspora in this work. But one of the things we're trying to uplift is the ways in which people have intentionally organized in their churches, businesses, communities for more than almost more than 2 centuries here in New Jersey, because often people do not understand those contributions.
But Sarah Washington, who I gave it as an example of that Atlantic City-based woman who had like the beauty empire. She produced beauty magazines for Black women and cosmetics, and she said beauty parlors. She set up a beauty school in South Africa. So yeah, and I think Madam C.J. Walker had a beauty school in Jamaica. So there were ways in which it was working both ways. Yeah, I think that's a good point you're making.
And actually, as I think we actually have something from our conference 2 years ago at the New Jersey Historical Commission, where Dolly from Lawnside, Mount Peace Cemetery, actually discussed African Americans who went back to Africa. But Rachel, are there more questions? We don't want to overlook. This is such a great conversation, and I'm just looking forward to continuing it.
Yeah, we do have a number of questions still in the chat. One quick one, go to Ms. Holloway. Was that area of Montclair predominantly African American? Glenridge Avenue to Alice Huey Foster's residence/business? I know today it's all business along Bloomfield.
Yeah, no, it was not. As a matter of fact, as I looked through the census records, the area where they bought their home is not far from the area where the business was. It was very, very integrated. The changeover did not occur until around 1910. And around 1910, even on the street where they lived, They were the only, where they had bought their home, which was Maple Plaza. They were the only Black family to own property on that street of Swedish, Irish, British, Italian immigrants who owned homes on that street. So the answer is no. And the real separation did not occur from what I was able to see in the census records until 1910.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm gonna jump to one that just came in, but it's for everyone, so I thought it might be a good one to head to, and then we have some questions about sources. So the question is, would you comment on African-American female doctors or lawyers in Newark and Montclair?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the period that I know best is the early, the 1910s and 1920s. And as far as I'm aware, there weren't any Black women lawyers in Newark at that time. There were a couple of Black male lawyers, and there were several Black male doctors. I haven't seen any Black women doctors or lawyers from that early of a period. I'm not saying that there weren't any, but I wasn't able to locate any.
Neither have I. And I certainly, after combing through the census records, the way that I have, there were husbands who were physicians, but I haven't found any women, physicians or lawyers.
Thank you for that. Jumping to, or Noelle, unless you had something.
Oh yeah, I can put it in the chat. So I think her name was Ernest May Carroll, and unfortunately, I had to go to Wikipedia. Please do not tell your children this. But she was in practice in New Jersey in 1929. So I can put her name in the chat.
Where was her office? Do you know?
I vaguely recall, I want to say it was in Montclair, but the city of Newark actually created. Yeah, I think it was in Montclair and Newark. She worked at Newark City Hospital, and she actually had a focus on treating venereal diseases too. So I can put her name in the chat. Folks, I think people used to talk more about her contributions in like the early 2000s, 1990s, but definitely that's someone we can bring to the fore. Another entity is just to remember Kinney Hospital, which was Newark's second Black hospital. It was started on Kinney Street. It's two different spellings though. And that was during the 1920s. Now, that hospital, with regard to Black women, is where that hospital was created, not because African Americans couldn't go to hospitals in Newark, but because Black women could not train as nurses in these hospitals. And so that's specifically why Kinney Hospital, which later became Community Hospital, and actually it was Black women, like one of Dr. Robb's favorite Black activists here, Grace Baxter Fenderson. They came together and they actually raised money to support Community Hospital. But yeah, that's where Black women could come to train as nurses. And that building actually still stands on Kinney Street. It was purchased by the church. But if you drive by, you can still see what the hospital looked like.
Yeah,
And
we need a plaque there.
Yeah, if I may add, Dr. Kinney lived in Montclair and was very much involved in racial solutions to problems that were arising in the area. He lived in Newark when he first moved here, but then he moved to Montclair, and his name is everywhere, for the work that he did here.
That's definitely a topic I didn't want to bring up for this panel,
Oh, sorry.
oh, did I interrupt you? Oh
No,
no, I was just stating, Betty, just that is that what you'll see is like a lot of Black professionals move from Newark to Montclair. So for example, at the Newark Museum, there's a little information in the Ballantine House about the O'Fakes, that family there, even though their house is now gone. At Rutgers, it's Rutgers Law School, or the building across from Rutgers Law School. There is still an existing O'Fake house in Montclair. And I meant to have that conversation too. That'll be another program.
no,
But
you're right. Yeah, that's a good topic, because I noticed that
yeah,
a number of the early Black men who were doctors and lawyers and owned funeral parlors, for example, in Newark, lived in East Orange or lived in Montclair. So you can already see like an early Black middle class moving out of Newark, just
yeah,
like the white middle class was doing too. So
yeah.
Thank you all. I'm going to jump to a couple of source questions. We got a couple of different ones, so we'll see how quickly we can get through. The first one was, where can I find more information on hairdressers?
well, I mean, a good place to start is the city directories in towns like Montclair and Newark, which you can find in public libraries. And the Newark Public Library has put all the city directories online, so you can, and that's a good place to start. And then once you have names, you can start looking in newspapers and a lot of newspapers are searchable to see if you can find some more information, advertisements, and things like that.
In Montclair, we had the Macassar Salon and Beauty Products. And actually, the information I got about them was from descendants of the Gen Z family that started that particular business. I haven't been able to find anything online, and it's basically been word of mouth from people who knew the family, knew about the business. And, they started in the building that's on Bloomfield Avenue with the big mural on the side, close to Maple Avenue as you're driving west on Bloomfield Avenue. You see that building where they had their beauty products and beauty salon and beauty school, I might add.
Really interesting. Thank you. The next source question we have is,
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel, really quickly.
please.
When we upload this video, I'll also include a link. I can't remember the scholar's name. She's a New Jersey scholar, and she's done her work around, I believe, hairdressers and Black women in the beauty business. She also did a video with the Kruger Scott Mansion. And so I can link that. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Katie Singer, who just recently published a book on oral histories in Newark that includes lots of information on Black women's businesses.
And I believe that Katie Singer may have put, if I'm remembering correctly, under the answers section of the Q&A, a link to the oral history collection, which we can also include when we send out the video. We have a question about newspapers. Did J.E. Sadler's Eastern Observer newspaper, Black-owned, in Montclair in this period provide coverage of local businesses in Montclair and Newark? Are many issues available?
I didn't find many issues available, but he was that Souvenir Journal. He did a lot of reporting in that Souvenir Journal for Booker T. Washington's visit. And, but I really don't know the answer to what he covered. I did find an ad where he was appealing to the homes where women worked for them to buy a subscription to his newspaper because it was uplifting news for the African-American community. But no, I haven't seen anything other than and I've looked for it, but I haven't found it.
Yeah, that's a problem because there were African American newspapers in New Jersey at different periods.
Yes.
They didn't often have a big circulation. They were often undercapitalized and didn't last that long. But the big problem is just a lot of them haven't survived because libraries and archives just didn't think they were worthwhile and didn't keep them, which is kind of a tragedy. But African American newspapers in New York City or Philadelphia would often that had larger circulations that are more likely to have survived often would cover information in New Jersey. So sometimes you can find information that way.
Yes, Alice's sister worked for another African-American newspaper that was in Montclair called the American Monitor. I searched and searched and searched and could not find an example of the coverage of that newspaper.
Yeah, it's sad. A lot of
It's really
newspapers
difficult.
also, yeah, a lot of them just didn't survive. People didn't bother to keep them, and yeah, it's too bad. It's a lot of lost history.
For sure, that is a tragedy. And hopefully more will resurface as we continue to research. Noelle, we have another question, but I don't know if what your thoughts are on the time.
Well, we should be closing up, but okay, we'll take one last question.
Sounds good. Another question in the chat was there a Quaker movement in Montclair and or Newark?
There weren't a lot of Quakers in Newark that I was aware of, maybe in an earlier period, but by the early 20th century, not really.
No, Montclair was Congregationalist, but I don't know that there was a movement, and I haven't done any research in that area. But that will be something that I look into.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Rachel, for moderating the questions. We really appreciated that. And on behalf of the New Jersey Historical Commission, I want to thank Ms. Holloway and Dr. Robb for presenting this evening. It's just been amazing. Thank you for the research and all of the work that you both have done, the communities that you're a part of, and the projects that you all have participated in. And we look forward to when we'll upload this program to YouTube, and we will also include the links to Ms. Holloway's and Dr. Robb's connections, their work, any other applicable presentations. And so I just want to say thank you. And what an amazing, presentation for Black History Month. I'm sure there are people who are here now who have learned things they didn't know before, and people in the future who will watch the recording. And it'll just hopefully expand scholarship and how people think of African American contributions in the state of New Jersey.
I learned a lot.
Okay, well, everyone have a good evening.